Time to lay down some serious.
He's eating a root of some special sort to sharpen his wits.
You know where your teenager is at 5 o'clock in the morning.
Hear the drummer get wicked.
Welcome to What Are We Doing Here, Episode 2. I'm your host, Vi11ain0u5 J, chef, service industry professional, and general all-around good motherfucker. Today we're going to talk about something that I think is very important to sort of keep in mind, and that's how efficiency and profitability may have damaged the understanding of what service should be when it comes to the restaurant industry, and specifically going out and paying money for the dining experience. One of the things that I touched on in the first video, and of course, if you're interested in this type of shit, you might find my first episode really interesting. So please feel free to jump in there. I'm sure there'll be a link somewhere in this process that you can kick into with less thinking than having to like and subscribe. Something else that would be much appreciated, because those types of things help the monster algorithm to love us even more. So let's satisfy that evil bastard and do all the things it tells us to do, like and subscribe. Anyway, um, I talked about the idea that a large amount of the changes that have happened in the service industry have come because of the influence of corporate restaurants, specifically a sort of strange corporate shift that happened as a result of many different factors that were going on in the earlier stages of my personal career. And from a sort of chronological perspective, you're looking at the mid 90s right through to the early 2000s. And one of those big things was this idea of, larger seating capacities and how you could maximize the profitability of those spaces. I don't think it started right off the hop. I think right off the hop, it was very much taking over spaces that existed. But at some point in time, corporations started to build their own restaurants, and they started to put in more seats. In fact, the average amount of seats went from the highest end being about 200 to just crazy large places, everything from like 300 to 650. The largest restaurant I've ever had to work in, that I have worked in, was one that had, during the winter season, remember in Canada, you would have about 350 seats. But when the summer hit and we had the patios opened, we ballooned to 650 seats. That's the largest footprint that I've ever serviced in my career. That was a little less than normalized back then, but I think it's now starting to shift into being a much more normal practice. But for the purposes of this conversation, we can just sort of use the low end average of about 200 seats. It's still a lot of people. It's still a large amount of infrastructure required to run spaces that large. And it also happens to potentially make and manifest a lot more profitability if it's properly run. So you got the corporations kind of going this route. And one of the things that I think started to become apparent was the idea that you couldn't do both. You weren't able to, in their mind, not saying that you have to do this way, but i I think the corporation decided to make a hardline choice between having people stay and spend more money on average versus pushing people in and out in a more in a more efficient fashion. So sort of the idea of table flipping versus sustained viability in sales. So if you kind of go backwards in time, we have restaurants that are driven by this idea of, provide them with this really unique experience and have them settle. And if you can keep them seated, you'll be able to, sell them more products, whether that be drinks, appetizers, or, a combination of those things. And like we talked about, smoking kind of facilitated that much more naturally because, again, smokers happen to stay longer. But now you have this other sort of approach. And if you're going and saying, okay, well, I have to be competitive in a marketplace, I have to start to look at what I can offer these people that's either unique or is efficient. And I think the efficiency won the day because if you look at today's industry and today's industry that's very much oversaturated with this more efficient model, then it's not hard to kind of put the two dots together and realize that the corporate model really did move away from the experience of service so that they could utilize the speed approach and ultimately flip tables more frequently. I labeled this the 45-minute flip. And I think it really boils down to a very simple understanding. It's matching two things. One, what can we execute and how quickly can we execute it safely and consistently? And the other side of the coin, what's the bare minimum that people are willing to accept in order to pay for things at a certain level? Now, paying for things at a certain level just means having an average spend per person that, if it's done frequently, in other words, if you can turn over those tables at a higher rate, that in and of itself will be profitable, and thereby removing the need for the service staff or the staff in general to be able to drive a higher rate of return per head. Because at the end of the day, we've already calculated our profitability on this sort of lower scale, almost like a low hanging fruit number. So if the average individual is spending about $70 a head, which I think is a fair number to assume, especially when you're going into things like a corporate restaurant. This is also under the understanding that most corporate restaurants don't price themselves too high and they don't price themselves too low. They truly look for that Goldilocks number, that perfect sort of in between, not so low that it seems cheap, not so high that it seems expensive, but that just right level. And I think if you do the average math and you assume that every individual is going to come in and have one drink, there's a high potential that they'll have at least one appetizer. If it's a couple, they'll share it. If it's a group, they might share two, or they might each have their own. If you'll notice, most corporate appetizers aren't exactly appetizers so much as they were shared plates that work better if people, well, share them. So that gets broken up into both individual spends. And then they'll each have an entree of some sort, whether that be a entree style salad, which is very commonplace in today's market, or whatever they're offering up as an entree, large pasta, a steak, even a burger, all of which are plated with a certain amount of ounces per plate so that you again derive an understanding of value based on the amount of money you spend there. It's not necessarily about the quality, it's about how much I'm getting and how much I'm paying. This is a very, very focused and engineered phenomenon that most corporate restaurants have definitely utilized to train guests into accepting certain pitfalls to their menu program simply due to the fact that, well, it's not so expensive. So you shouldn't be driven to complain too much unless it's so horribly executed that you have to complain. And at that point in time, given the lower amount of numbers of people who will complain in person versus complain online after the fact, which ultimately doesn't really matter to most restaurants or restaurateurs unless they have such a small market share that they require that kind of adulation to continue their success. Most corporate restaurants can give a fuck. You're still going to come, and there's enough people out there that will still come and pander the place that they don't really have to worry about it. And unless you're telling people that you were poisoned there, everybody's got a complaint about a corporate restaurant. Just go and look up your rant and rave for your area and see how many people are bitching and complaining about drive-throughs and how their subpar products are subpar. Not as if you didn't know that before you got there. Do you know what I mean? You're paying like $6 for something. What'd you expect? I digress. So you get into this position where value is the primary, and then it starts to break down from there. Going back to the spend, you've got your entree. You might luck out and sell them an app like a dessert and maybe a coffee, but that's it. And again, if you're having a couple, there's a very high potential that they're going to share the dessert. So it becomes another shared product. All in, you're probably around $70. $70 by two people, $140, and then so on and so on and so on. So you've got this kind of low average spend per person. If your restaurant's slow, then that's really not profitable unless you're really clever with how you're engineering all of the infrastructure of your restaurant. And that goes down to how much support staff you hire, how many individuals are on the floor at a given time, how many people are in the kitchen, what's your management structure like? Do you have a lot of management? How are you paying them? And it all kind of economically starts to sort of trickle down to a point where if you're not running it in a corporate model and you don't have that superior buying power and comfort, there's really high potential that if you don't do these little things correctly, it'll all add up to you having a negative impact financially and likely will affect your business, well, in totality to the detriment and most like failure, whether or not that's happening today or if it's manifesting today and will happen tomorrow. The reality is most businesses in the service industry are uh, kind of like the coyote running over the cliffside and not realizing that they're falling. They think that they're still okay, but they're really not. There's no ground under them and they're just about to fall. A lot of businesses are in this position. It's a precarity that you have an illusion of knowledge that allows you to separate from that. Very, very transparent to most, but obviously obfuscated to you because you have faith in your project and you'll make it work. And the reality is you're in free fall and you don't know it yet. And I think there's a large amount of businesses in today's market that are in that position. I would argue that there's a large part of businesses that are in that position because they try to copy a corporate model without having the corporate backing that corporations do have. To kind of go into that a little bit deeper, corporations have created a model that they feel is successful. And it's likely successful in the times in which it's being exercised at its maximum. In other words, these types of models work for the times when you are busiest. And there's an anticipation by most corporate models that there's going to be a higher rate of business or being busy that will require this type of thing versus when we're not busy and it's detrimental to our business. Now, just to address that very quickly, I don't think that's correct. I think the reality is that these models are inherently flawed and have always been inherently flawed because there's a lack of flexibility and ultimately a lack of investment by the company in its frontline workers to create a much more sustainable and self-sufficient staff and individual or actor within that system so that there is less of a need for them to formulaically structure every service with the same sort of lack of mental nuance that would help a business grow because of a lack of spending on inefficient tools. Okay, to say this in a much more simple way and less word salady, if you don't make better workers, then you're going to have to use a lot more of those workers than if you actually invested in making better workers. But there's a catch. And that investment isn't just a foundational, I have to make a manifesto and a training program for my staff and then, of course, execute it. It's a financial one. You need to put people into scenarios with smarter, stronger, faster, and more experienced staff in order for these things to actually manifest. In other words, you can't just give them a 3 or 4 day lesson and then throw them in feet first and hope that they swim. That's ineffective and by and large happens to create worse staff. Then you're stuck in a position where because everybody's low skilled or not grasping all of the things, or quite frankly, unaware of how to be successful in the environment, they tend to require more support, which then means you're adding more layers to this management, supervisors, and those people cost more money, whether it be hourly or in a salary structure. And that in and of itself can be incredibly financially detrimental to a business that may not be flourishing because its cost effectiveness is lost. If I'm copying this model and I don't have that comfort and that ability to spend more without thinking to a degree, then I'm probably going to start losing a lot of money. In fact, hemorrhaging money on the backs of bad service. Now, add that on top of the fact that I'm not as busy. And because I'm not as busy, this idea of multi flipping or hyper flipping my dining room isn't going to be effective. Then I'm even losing more money because now I'm not even offering a strong service model. Okay, so let's kind of break that down a little bit further. I think I may have went too far. So what do I mean when I say I've broken down a service model and made it simpler? Well, service is secondary to efficiency, right? So if that's the case, and if that's the main focus of most of these organizations, then you're not having servers as a majority of a profession thinking in terms of being a salesperson, because the training programs that are out there and most pervasive are ones that are very much about the mechanics of service. So I have to do X amount of things to get through this process. That idea of like, you get the greeting, you then go back afterwards, and then you get a drink order, unless you've managed to get the drink order at the greeting, right? And all of these steps all kind of break down by literal minutes, 2 minute micro moments that don't really have any rapport and are designed just to get the information you need so that you can move the boulder forward. The same answer for all of the tertiary departments that support this understanding. From a kitchen perspective, dishes become more efficiency driven and less about whether or not, again, they're interesting or dynamic or flavorful. It's about how quickly can I execute that dish. Drinks, same answer. They're probably going to be simpler and more streamlined so that they can be efficiently executed. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that efficiency isn't something that should always be at the primary of most systems, because that's where a lot of money can be lost. However, I wouldn't suggest that you utilize efficiency as the main focus of the entire experience. I would argue that you need to start to look at how nuanced you've gone with these kinds of structured and how much is lost because it's far too efficient. Think of it this way. If everything that I do with the table as a server is broken up into 2 minute blocks, then there's a very high potential that when this is all said and done, I, as a server, have likely spent no more than 12 minutes with each table. 12 minutes. And this is broken up into multiple visits. The longest amount of time I'm likely spending with you is in my initial greeting and when I'm trying to express whatever the features or specials are so that you can get, again, kind of driven into some sort of sale or at least a suggestion of something different. It's also probably the back end of the service when I'm thanking you for the time we spent together, high-fiving you, taking your money, and sending you home. The parts in between, the quality checks, the delivery of different items, and the clearing of those items after they're completed are broken into very small increments where there's not a lot of back and forth anyway. Contrast that with the system that I was taught with, and that every opportunity you are with a table was an opportunity to prime a sale, to get to know somebody, to work an angle, and to ultimately make their experience more interesting. And you realize that, sure, maybe I'm spending another 3 to 5 minutes in totality with these people, but they're also spending a higher amount of money. They're tipping me at a higher percentage, and retention becomes much more possible as a result of the uniqueness of the experience they've had. Simple point of fact, I, Jason or Villainous J, am a unique individual who has a unique approach, who speaks in a unique tone, who does unique things. Contrast that with somebody who I work with. Let's call them Jimmy. Jimmy is also a unique person with unique ideas and a unique approach. And ultimately, each of us, although we're trying to execute the same sort of things, are going to do it in a different way. That creates a unique experience, and that will bring people back, unless it's a negative experience. And that in and of itself will likely drive them not to come back. So unless Jimmy is a fucking asshole, or I'm a fucking asshole to these people, and they don't like being treated like assholes, because yes, ironically enough, there's quite a few people out there that like being treated like assholes because they embrace their assholery. Um, we're probably going to have people coming back, maybe even to see each other. Conversely, looking at different experiences from different people in the same restaurant. What if they come back and Jimmy's not there and they get stuck with Jay? Do they enjoy that experience on the same level? Is it unique? Does it give me another reason to come back? Because shit, now I've had 2 times there. They were totally different experiences, and I liked them both equally. I want to go back. Maybe I'll get Jane, and she'll give me a totally unique. Do you see where I'm going with this? It's that idea of we don't have to hit the points on the grid the same way in order to accomplish the goal. But the difference is that I was trained in an environment where I was given the ability through practice, attrition, and apprenticeship with people who had been in the business for much longer than I had to start to gain the skills to be able to understand how to read a relationship with a party or a guest or a group of guests to drive them around hitting those points that I'm supposed to hit, but doing it in a unique way that's very specific to the guest and what their experience should be and what they might be looking for. Contrast that with today, and I don't think that they have that same ability. And why is that? Well, because again, we've replaced experience with efficiency, and we've removed any of the barriers in that efficiency from the equation. Again, here we go. So you get a room of 200 people. So you've got 200 seats. And the peak hours of your seats and your seating is probably twofold. So let's assume that this is a 6-day-a-week restaurant, right? So that means we're open from Tuesday through Sunday. And let's take Sunday and let's create brunch on Sunday, which is always a unique day. So we kind of remove it from the equation. And we assume that it's going to be like 11 o'clock till 3 p.m. And it's just going to be brunch, which has a different price point and a different level of service and different requirements. So let's just kind of remove it for this conversation. So let's assume we're on Tuesday through Saturday. We'll probably have 2 focal point rush points, right? You're going to have the sort of morning lunch rush. We're going to take breakfast off the table. This restaurant doesn't have a breakfast program. It's a lunch driven place. So we're going to set the hours on the weekly basis from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. This is kitchen time and service and restaurant service. There might be an hour at the end for bar to kind of close down and keep people, but let's just assume the kitchen operates from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. There's a high potential that your busiest time during the opening phases of your day is going to be 11:30 till 1:30, right? It's about 120 minutes. And because it's a lunch period, the average spend is going to drop. So we'll say the average spend during the lunch period, let's give it between like say 35 and $45. Maybe you just agree that it's $40. Okay. And then our dinner period or our higher price point period will likely hit from 6 p.m. till 8:30 p.m. That's 150 minutes. We're doing this in minutes instead of hours because there's a reason. Okay. Remember, we're going to go back to the 45-minute flip idea, and that's going to be our seating time per table. We're going to use that as our example, and it's going to be all the time. So every time a person comes into this restaurant, 45 minutes is the expected amount of time they need to be there. Okay. Okay. So back to dinner. So your dinner period, we've got our rush period being that 6 till 8:30. Let's assume that dinner starts from 4 p.m. to 11 p.m. Let's assume lunch runs from 11 a.m. till 4 p.m. Sure, you'll have features, but none of that's relevant. Our average spend at night, we already kind of covered. It's probably going to be $70 to $75. Let's go for the low end. Let's do $70, right? So far we're looking at about $40 per person at the lunch period, and we're looking at $70 per person at the dinner period. And our biggest peakest rush, our rush when we think we're going to fill our dining room and we're going to be able to maximize those flips for the lunch period, 11:30 till 1:30, and from the dinner period, 6 till 8:30. We're all on the same page. Beautiful. So if our 200 seats get sat on the average that we think we can do, which is 45 minutes, at the lunch period, we're looking at 2.7 dining room flips with 45 minutes each table that will fit into that 120-minute block. Okay. And if we're able to do that from a sales perspective, we're looking at $8,000. $8,000 per seating times 2.7 is $21,600. That's for one night or one afternoon, if you can maximize that flip. From the dinner perspective, we've got 150 minutes that we've established as our peak time, which means we're looking at 3.3 flips of that dining room. And if 200 seats, one at $70 per head, we're looking at $14,000 per seating times 3.3 gives us $46,200 for one 150-minute period. Now you take that information and you multiply that by the one day. So for 270 minutes of a full day, we could possibly make $67,800. I think I said that right. Anyway, if I messed that up, I apologize. Right? So that in and of itself means that on a daily basis, if we were able to hit these statistics just in those 2 periods of time, which would cost us 270 minutes out of our full day, which is 720 minutes, because we're open from 11 till 11, right? We're making $67,800. If you then take that and pretend that we can do that, we're not going to be able to do this every day. So let's assume the worst case scenario, 3 times a week, we can manage this kind of stuff. Fuck it. Let's call it Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Okay. If I can do that 3 times a week, right? I'm looking at $203,400 for 3 days at a total amount of minutes of 810 minutes. And if I look at 720 minutes per day, and I look at that from Tuesdays through Saturdays, that gives me a total of 3,600 minutes. And of those minutes, I'm literally only using 810 of them to make $203,400. If I'm flipping these tables at this high rate of 45, and I can maximize my seating during that small amount of time, that's a lot of money. I mean, in a future episode, I'm sure I can do the math and break stuff down and give you exactly what the cost would be for that kind of thing. But let's be honest, that's a lot of money, and that's not even the full nut. That's not including the fact that, sure, you're going to have smaller seatings. You might have busier rushes once in a while. You might have days that are more successful that you didn't see coming. And that doesn't even include fucking brunch, which some brunch places can maximize the flip times and hit that lunch period, which we've already established is $8,000 per seating at about $35 or $40 per person. That's a lot of money on top of everything else. At a brunch, I might be able to pull off $40 a head if I price my stuff just right. And I add a lot of alcoholic drinks that are really, really, really satisfying to people who are hungover, who I can then get to order a little bit larger portions and pay a little bit larger because of the optic, right? Like this is where you start getting into like the commerce of the restaurant and how you can sort of finagle amounts of money out of people. And little bits go a long way when you're kind of looking at it in a bigger picture point. But think about this. This is the super efficient model. This is the no fuss, no muss, no bullshit, let's give her. And we're literally looking at things like such small increments of time where you're spending with your table. So let's kind of do the quick breakdown of what we're looking at here. Let's pretend for argument's sake that we have a table come in and there's a host. So the host is going to greet that table. They're going to seat them. And they might do a mention because there's a lot of corporations, a lot of restaurants that do this where they have their host give you some sort of sales hook. Tonight is Margarita Mondays. We highly recommend you have X. Today is Taco Tuesday. And we like our combo to have a taco and a margarita or a Corona, whatever the fuck, right? So they do their greeting. It's cool. Then you go by as the server and you're realistically trying to greet them from your perspective. The host greets the table from the restaurant's perspective. Now you're introducing yourself. You're doing a greeting of yourself. And during that greeting time, best case scenario, you're getting that drink order. Why? Because again, it's hurrying the process. It's also removing another step and a back and forth in a visit. Again, back in the day, it would be very different. We'd want more visits. We'd want to stretch the service. But in this case, we're looking at 45-minute window from the time they sit to the time they pay their check. 45 minutes. That's the game. So I get your drink order, then I'm coming back, and that's about a 2-minute visit. 2 to 4 minutes is the window that you're looking at. But let's be honest, if you're being efficient, you know your shit. Hi, my name's blah blah. This is what we're doing tonight. Can I offer you something to drink? Right? And remember, the host has already primed you in some way to sort of get you thinking about drinks, because if they're smart, they've said something about drinks, so you're starting to prepare. And you're likely already a trained guest, either coming to this place or others. So you're already primed and ready to start getting that order together, because you know if you don't get that order in, you might wait. And now we're in a position where we want to get the fuck out as quick as possible. So you're in your best interest to know exactly what you need when you need it right away. So I get your drink order, and that's the best case scenario. And I prime the dinner or the meal conversation with, when I come back, we'll take care of your food order. And you get to your bar, you get your drink, you come back. Okay, so your first visit's 2 minutes. My second visit, because I've already told them, hey, get your order together. I deliver the drink, and as I'm delivering the drink, I start talking about your food order. You can ask your questions. I can usually circumnavigate them quickly. If it's something like, I can't eat X, can I have Y? Most corporate restaurants will let you piecemeal your stuff, so they'll let you take things out for allergies and intolerances, which is very progressive. If you have the space to do it, hurrah to that. If you don't, because it's misleading and it sucks. So we're back to that idea of like, it's going to take me about 2 minutes to get that order from you, plus the walk to the POS, call it 3 minutes for the totality of that action. And now you're in the clock for the restaurant or for the kitchen. If I can't get your drink order on the first pass, then on the second pass, I'm getting your drink order, and then I'm driving to get your food order at the same time. So I'm going to try to flip that script and get into at least getting ahead. And if I'm not able to get your food order, then it's going to take me another pass. By the time I deliver your drink order, then we're into the food order. And if you've got the same structure as most, once you've taken the food order, you're just going to swing by and drop plates off and cutlery. If you're busy, you're going to do this for multiple tables in your section. And if you're not, you're likely just going to make a trip on your trips, or you might bring it with you when you deliver the food. So the next visit's going to be the food delivery, right? Again, that's not going to take very long, because realistically, you're just putting food in front of people. If there's some sort of weird garnish caddy or whatever, it's already been delivered when you dropped off the cutlery or when you were doing a pass to just check in on them because you were moving through your section. Good servers will check on their tables multiple times while they move through their section. Bad servers will only go to the table when they actually have to. And I do believe that there are more people who practice that methodology than continually move throughout their section in order to stay connected with their tables. Again, these are very different approaches. One was very pervasive in my time. One is more pervasive today. And it's very much I use the idea of a spokes on a wheel concept. You have to go to a place and come back, then go to a place, come back, then go to a place, and come back, rather than doing a loop where you're consistently passing through that section, and you're also touching areas that you need in order to satisfy the mechanics of your job. Things like your POS, your kitchen, and your service bar. And again, that's called loops. And a looping system is something that really strong servers practice, but a great deal of servers don't do anymore, because again, it's just not as commonplace as it used to be, which is a shame nonetheless. So I've dropped the food off. I'm going to go back into the 2 bites, 2 minutes kind of concept. The idea being, after 2 bites or 2 minutes, you've had your 2 bites, a guest can establish whether or not they're happy with their meal. And if there's any course correction required, like a refire or a redo or a change out because they're not happy with it, that's the time to do it, because after that, it becomes more difficult to satisfy the guest, right? If I don't get the thing I really liked or the thing I ordered I'm not happy with, and it takes me half of my dish to get that expressed to a server, I'm going to be pissed off, and I'm not going to usually be happy. However, if it's within the first 2 bites, then you're catching that, then that gives me an opportunity as a guest to repair my experience, It's going to bode very well for the service staff as well as the establishment because you've certainly addressed my needs as a guest before your requirements to get me out. Does that make sense? I think it does. Once we've gotten through dinner and there's been no problems, now while we're clearing, priming the idea of a dessert or a coffee or an after dinner thing. If that's not going to happen, you're likely going to find out about that during the clearing phase. Now, we're not really dessert people. No problem. And at that exact crucial moment is where a major part of the service industry has changed from what it used to be. Because we would never just offer the bill. We would wait back in the day. Because at any point in time, someone would say, I'm not a dessert person. I'm not going to bill you out because I might be able to sell you a drink. I might be able to sell you something. But in today's market, there's a high potential that you're going to get this while I'm clearing your dinner plates. Are you having dessert? No, we're not really dessert people. Great. Can I bring you the check then? And most of the time, it's not, can I bring you the check? It'd be like, great, I'll be back with your check. Because in today's service style, that's a win for the establishment. Why? Because I'm clearing your table in less than 45 minutes. You see my point? Which means I've now cleared that real estate. Now I can flip it, reset it, and have another set of people put back in their spot so that I can get them to spend. That $70 minimum most likely never includes dessert. That's like an after dinner thing that allows you to win because most people don't sell desserts anymore. Why? Because most people don't eat them. It's not because of a lack of creativity or a lack of care or a lack of wanting it. Intolerances have made a lot of changes to the way we approach dessert. And let's be honest, there's a lot of food trends that just have removed dessert in totality. It's kind of like a archaic, almost clunky back end. People would be more inclined to have snacks and drinks than they would to have a piece of pie or a bowl of ice cream. Now, I'm not saying that dessert's not still ordered. I'm just saying it's an afterthought that a lot of people don't necessarily look to in their models of profitability and what they can sell to an individual. Does that make sense? So when you look at this kind of mode of service and the idea of efficiency and that idea of commerce being the central focal point and realistically profitability, then you have to understand that this idea doesn't seem to make any less sense than any others. In fact, it seems really successful. Look at those numbers. I mean, again, for the lowest amount of time, 810 minutes a day, I can make $200,000. That sounds good, right? But here's the problem. This would really be successful if the individuals who are driving it have the ability to acknowledge that they need to stretch the service or have people stay longer and spend more when they're not at their peak efficiency. So think about it this way. If the $70 minimum is the minimum accepted spend versus the expected spend in totality, then you can start to build on top of that to create a higher level of rate of return when you can offer the time to the guest. Not every minute of these days is spent at peak efficiency. 720 available minutes, and of those 270 represent these two rush pockets for 3 out of your 6 days. Even if you take away the fact that we're using brunch as a sort of removed service, and we're just looking at 5 days, that gives us 2 days and an insane amount of hours per day or an insane amount of minutes per day where we could potentially be getting more money. But because we've trained everybody with this efficiency profitability model of 45 minutes and get the fuck out, we can't see that there could be a higher profitability in being able to do a much more focused and stretched out service that was experience driven in the points when you're not at peak hours. In fact, you could probably extend those peak hours after those to get a higher rate of return if you were trying to keep the people seated. Then just giving them warnings, like when we're at our peak hours, there's a 45-minute seating limit. That makes sense on its face. People don't argue with that when the place is full. But when you're doing it without saying it, when this is the backbone of how you're approaching service, you can't pivot because you're unaware of how to do so. And that's the issue with the way in which we're training today. We're training like paint by numbers rather than allowing the people to learn how to paint. Does that make sense? If I'm painting by numbers, I'm just following whatever I'm being told to do. The scenarios are overly simplistic, and I don't have any need to think outside of the box. In fact, most corporate restaurants, most modern restaurants that are stealing the corporate model would be more willing to comp, discount, or provide you with a coupon than try to repair your service because they can't acknowledge when the service is needing repair. When that relationship with the guest is corroded because they're unhappy with their experience, there's nobody who has the ability to acknowledge or recognize that. So they go right into that default idea of saying, hey, I'll just discount it or give you something for free and imagine that you'll come back because, hey, I gave you free stuff. So you'll pay me back by coming back. It's a very askew model, but it's one that's very, very pervasive, not just in corporate restaurants, in restaurants in total. And then you get even deeper into the idea that because most of our staff are being trained with these lacking models that don't help them to understand or recognize how to drive a service, and then again, acknowledge those moments where you need to stretch the service to get a higher rate of return versus where you have to be hyper efficient. Well, then we ultimately have no ability for these people to grow. And because growth is not a major focus of training today, then there's no reason to actually invest in those individuals. And then you take that even further and you realize that because most of these people are not the best at what they do because they've never been taught how to be so successful, then you need to start building up a bunch of structure around them to protect your system. So you'll put more of them on at a higher rate of return for you to pay out. It's less profitable, but optically you're thinking if I put more of them out there, then it mitigates the possibility of them fucking up. So service staffs get bigger because the people that they're hiring are less trained. They have less professional acumen. So you have to support them. And then you have to put in things like managers and supervisors. Now, you can pay all of these individual soldiers a lower rate. In fact, in Canada specifically, you can pay hourly rate servers a lower number than the minimum wage because of tips. This is how we've managed to make it so that people who have gratuity don't get the same number as people who don't. But if you have a supervisor or you have a manager, you either have to put them on a salary with some sort of package or you have to pay them a higher hourly rate because no one's going to supervise for free. So now you have to have a supervisor and you have to have a manager. And with a manager comes a second manager because we're talking about a 12-hour day and you can't have one person stay on the clock all the time because even under the salary structure, you still have to kind of stay within the idea of no more than 8 hours per person per day or else you go into overtime. And if you don't consider that when you have people on salary, then there's a high potential that those salaried employees can then come back and go to the employee standards board, for instance, and complain that you put them on salary, but you illegally pushed them past their normal hour times and did not address overtime. You don't get to sneak and skate the laws just because you're giving somebody a salary. You, in fact, have to still abide them very specifically. In other words, you can't just overwork them because they're on salary. And God forbid you have somebody who's on salary who can do like simple math and realizes every hour past the expected work hours that the established salary number was based on is carving away at your hourly rate to the extent that you're getting paid less than minimum wage and less than everybody around you. Without the benefit of overtime, you'll start losing people faster than you can say, go fuck yourself. I don't want to work here anymore. You know? So a large amount of these types of things have all sort of smushed together to create an inherited system that now nobody acknowledges is broken, even though it's very clear. Even when you look at it from the brass tacks of really small numbers, it's crazy profitable during the times where you're most busy. But if you're not busy, this is an incredibly lacking model that does nothing but undermine the ability for that restaurant to capture a higher rate of return and higher retention from people, because they're always going to perceive you as some sort of strange feedery that just wants you to come in, get out, and spend the minimum amount with the minimum amount of effort being put into your experience. Why? Because experience is secondary to efficiency. As long as we're taking this tactic, as long as we're looking at things from this perspective, regardless of if you're a corporate restaurant or you're a privately owned restaurant or you're a restaurant with a group of people who all got together and pooled their money and decided to do something stupid, all of these things will all eventually corrode into a place where there's not enough people coming to satisfy this model. And now you have a huge problem. There's nobody who works with you who has the ability to do more than what you've allowed them to understand they're capable of doing. Your training has not invested any time and any growth into anybody. As a result, you have a whole bunch of like single thought processed individuals who lack the dynamics to be able to be incredibly successful within your space, regardless of whether or not you're at peak or you're at your least successful moments when it comes to the amount of traffic that you're experiencing at a given time. We cannot only plan for when we're busy. We have to anticipate the times when we are least busy, how we can be profitable in those moments while still providing something that allows the guest to want to return. That should never, ever just be how consistent and how efficient I can be in satisfying your base requirements, which will then derive the base amount of money spent, which will then offer you nothing other than the concept of being able to be fed by somebody with something that I can somewhat trust, because every time I go there, it can be worse. If we're using the "it could be worse" model when we're creating a service industry in 2024 and we're maintaining this, well, I ask a simple fucking question. What are we fucking doing here?
If you enjoyed this chat, don't forget to like and subscribe and do all the fun YouTube things. It certainly keeps me motivated to create cool content, and I welcome some comments. So jump right in there and start our discussion.